Good evening, everybody. Good evening, and thank you all for joining us this evening. I'm William Jenkins, the Interim Director of the City Institute at York University in Toronto, Canada. And I'm including this geographical precision, mindful of the fact that we are fortunate to have speakers with us who are not only 3 time zones away on Canada's west coast in Victoria, British Columbia, but also in Los Angeles, Rio de Janeiro, and Tokyo. Our institute, the City Institute, was established as an organized research unit at York in 2006. We are a community of affiliated university professors, graduate students, senior undergraduate students, postdoctoral fellows, and visiting scholars who all share an interest in the collaborative, interdisciplinary, and critical urban research. And despite the realities of COVID-19, we are carrying on with our research as best we can, with our institute operating in a virtual capacity as with the rest of the university. Our researchers are engaged in projects that examine issues of urbanization and gender in the global south, also issues of housing and suburbanization in Canada and other parts of the world. We also look at the phenomenon of the smart city, for example. And of course, we also do research on several issues affecting Toronto and its surrounding region. And although we are not gathered in the same location right now, I'd like to acknowledge that many Indigenous nations in this part of Canada have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of the university. York acknowledges its presence on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations, and that this territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Belt Covenant, an agreement to share and care for the Great Lakes region. This evening's session is entitled Global Diseases and Resistance Networks in Olympic Cities. And our moderator for this evening is Dr. Amanda Lisio, Assistant Professor of Physical Culture, Policy and Sustainable Development in the School of Kinesiology and Health Sciences at York University, and an affiliated faculty member with us at the City Institute. And I'd like to thank Amanda for her commitment and hard work in organizing this evening's seminar. The topic has been a central part of her own research career to date. She has, for instance, undertaken research in Rio de Janeiro and has been awarded funding for her work from agencies in the United Kingdom, as well as here in Canada. So thanks once again to all of you out there for tuning in. I wish you all a great evening, and I will now hand over to Amanda, who will introduce this evening's speakers.
That which is typically recognized as data, knowledge, and expertise in academia. At some level, the work of Spike, Itani, Laura, and Christine is connected through a shared ambition to work with communities to incorporate personal histories and testimonies into an academic context. This ambition is also connected to cities and health. Health not as determined by, but not limited to, housing precarity, food insecurity, police brutality, climate crises, access to dignified labor and needed income, and freedom from illness and disease. We wanted to invite this panel to discuss their specific work in Olympic cities, knowing that the protest against the Olympic movement is part of a broader movement of organized resistance, because the International Olympic Committee, as well as FIFA, intensifies and resultantly magnifies the processes, priorities, and personalities that shape the cities we come to live. As observed in the construction of Tokyo 2020 as an event that has yet and may not ever occur, 370 people were evicted, more than half over the age of 65, and some already displaced for the 1964 Olympic Games. Police have been armed with the latest in surveillance technologies for the first ever AI secured sport mega event. Timber has been sourced from Indonesia and Malaysia, which has contributed to rapid deforestation, and the mostly migrant labor force were forced to buy their own personal protective equipment, overwork without formal contract, and 2 people have since lost their lives. As we will soon see, none of this is unique to Tokyo or Japan. It is clear that the decision of cities to host a sport mega event in general and the Olympic event in particular has inevitably led to more aggressive policing, heightened corruption, budget malfeasance, environmental degradation, displacement, and gentrification. These realities, evident across host cities, have resulted in the emergence of a global network of Olympic resistance. More than advocate for the cancellation of Olympic parties, everyone in this webinar has used the global spectacle to draw attention to, with the hope to ultimately change, the type of uneven development that has become synonymous with the sport mega event. In recent time, we witnessed the 2016 and 2020 games be nearly and now temporarily canceled due to two different zoonotic diseases, the insect-borne Zika virus and COVID-19. And we cannot help but wonder if these viruses will upend transnationally imposed mega development as we know it, or if something else will be learned and gained from the movement of people determined to stop it. As such, we welcome to this webinar in this order, Spike Friedman, an organizer with No Olympics LA and Ground Game LA. He's a recent graduate of UCLA Luskin's Urban Planning Program, where he researched housing justice with the Lewis Center and the Institute on Inequality and Democracy. His writings on sports and politics have been published by Grantland, The Stranger, LA Magazine, and Deadspin, among others. Next, we will have Dr. Itani Saroko, an associate professor of sport, gender, and sexuality at Kansai University in Japan. Their work has examined policies historically enacted by the IOC to test, regulate, and reinforce a sexist logic of female inferiority and transphobia in sport. Their work especially illustrates the manner in which bodies of women and gender variant people are routinely medicalized in Olympic competition. Through this interest, Itani has collaborated with Akatawa Link, which loosely translates to No Thanks the Olympic Disaster, as well as its affiliate Hogoring Nonkai, No Olympics 2020 in Japan. Dr. Laura Murray will present third. She is a filmmaker, activist, and assistant professor at the Center for Public Policy Studies and Human Rights at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and has collaborated with Davide Brazil since 2004. With Davide, the National Sex Worker Organization, she has served in diverse capacities, most recently as the coordinator of O Que Você Não Vê, What You Don't See, a photojournalism exhibition to share 2016 Olympic realities from the perspective of women, cis and trans, involved in sex work in Rio de Janeiro. In 2020, Laura co-authored an article in an open access journal published by The Lancet entitled Coronavirus in Brazil, the Heavy Weight of Inequality and Unsound Leadership, as well as the prostitute, the city, and the virus on COVID-19, hygienist theories of urban reform, and local resistance. Last but certainly not least, we will have Dr. Christine O'Boswin. Christine is an Abanki from the Odanak First Nation and associate professor of history and indigenous studies at the University of Victoria, located on Lekwungen, Sagis, Esquimalt, and Wasayanik homelands. Her work focuses on the legal and political rights of indigenous peoples in settler colonial Canada, particularly in hosting the Olympic Games and other events on treaty lands, as well as those indigenous territories that remain treatyless or unceded. I created and will share a chat. In the chat, I will share a document with a selection of their open access work in case anyone's interested to read and learn more from this incredibly insightful panel. But for now, I'll pass it over to Spike. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Amanda, and thank you to York University, William, and everyone who was involved in organizing this event, and to the amazing panelists. It's an honor to be here alongside you. Let me share my screen really quickly. It is happening right now, and there it is. Excellent. Hello, everybody. I am Spike Friedman. I am an organizer with No Olympics LA, among other things, and I'm here to talk about the impact of COVID-19 on both our organizing effort and our analysis over the past 6 to 8 months. But first, who is No Olympics LA? We actually started in 2017 as a response to LA's Olympic bid out of the Democratic Socialists of America, quickly expanded to become a coalition, including groups fighting for social justice on a number of lines across the Southern California region. We currently have over 25 plus groups in our coalition, and we work regularly with Olympic opposition groups across the globe under the No Olympics Anywhere banner. That's actually how I'm lucky enough to know Itani, the next speaker in this event. And so, yeah, again, in terms of what this presentation will be, we're going to talk first about organizing and how COVID has impacted the organizing efforts of No Olympics LA. And then we're going to get into how COVID has informed our analysis of the games and reinforced our analysis of why the Olympics are problematic for all host cities, but in particular, the city of Los Angeles. All right, so organizing under COVID. It seems very quotidian, but one of the more important impacts, and this is a urban planning school to a degree, so I think this is important, is it's normalized digital organizing. And within a city and metropolitan region like Los Angeles, this is crucial for an organizing effort that is contesting something as broad as the Olympic Games in terms of geographic scope of impact. It is really important for us to be able to organize digitally. Again, this seems minor, but the fact that there is less traffic, the fact that we do not need to drive to Inglewood or Long Beach or Carson or Riverside, these are places that might not mean anything to you, but these can be 2+ hour drives at rush hour. This allows for us to build community across the geography of Los Angeles, which allows us to build solidarity amongst tenants movements, amongst environmental organizers, and amongst just all those who are potentially going to be affected by the game. It also means that we've gotten more student engagement. UCLA and USC, the two largest research institutions in Los Angeles, are also important Olympic sites in the proposed 2028 layout. UCLA will provide the Olympic Village. USC will provide some of the venues as well as the media village for the games. And so engaging students now in these digital spaces has been crucial in terms of broadening the support of the sorts of populations that will be directly affected by the games. We've also been able to have a number of teach-ins with our allies from across the globe, and our allies who have moved away from Los Angeles for whatever reason are able to continue with the work that we're doing. When we talk about opposing the Olympic Games in Los Angeles, a big piece of that involves civic education, letting people know why the Olympics are bad, letting them know how they're bad. And so a big piece of our work is media. It is these sort of teach-in events where we can get our message out. But it has, in obvious negative ways, really changed how we can connect with our community. We have a major program called Homes Not Hotels, in which we are organizing the Hollywood neighborhood of Los Angeles around Airbnbs and hotel development amidst one of the worst housing crises the region has ever seen. And how we were doing that was we were knocking on the doors of those in apartment buildings who were potentially affected by the gentrifying impacts of hotel and room sharing growth. And we can't do that anymore for safety. It's also limited the scope of our direct actions. No Olympics has done a number of events that focus on spectacle and raising awareness through banner drops, through in-person big events and big sort of disruptive events. And some of those are off the table under COVID. And I'm going to show some images of what we have been doing, but those are limited. It's also limited the scope of what we can do in terms of primarily those who are engaged online, which in a city as diverse and especially as language diverse as Los Angeles has meant reaching certain aspects of the population is actually harder than ever. And we've also had allies and members get sick from COVID. I myself was sick, and it is a big drain on our organizing effort, and also just personally. It is very hard to have COVID-19, and the effects are long-term. And I'm not going to get too far into my own personal story, but it is not great. Not great. Hot take, do not get COVID-19. Oh no, there we go. So these are the images of some of the events that we have put together over the last 6 months. And you can see that all of these are masked up, and they have to be a little more contained and responsive to the moment. The largest event that we've worked on was the March for Melly, where one of our organizers, Albert Corrado, his sister was killed by LAPD at a local Trader Joe's grocery store. And we helped organize an event that was a march in her honor on the 2-year anniversary of that shooting. And Albert spoke, and it was that's probably the largest event that No Olympics has been directly organizing. But you can see outside of SoFi Stadium, we did a banner drop to highlight the lives lost related to COVID during the construction of SoFi. We went directly to LA28 Olympic organizer Casey Wasserman's house, and we went to the office of new city council member Kevin De Leon, who is a large figure in California politics, to protest evictions and the displacement of so many related to COVID-19. Again, the scale of what we're doing is smaller and more contained. Masks are a big part of it. Safety and testing are a big part of it. We have still been able to get out into the city, although with the current surge in cases, it's harder than ever. Oh, there we go. All right, so our analysis. We categorically oppose the prospect of an LA Olympics, period. The way we see it is there is no version of the Olympic Games that can be done responsibly and that will not hurt the most vulnerable Angelenos. Therefore, we oppose any version of the LA Olympics. And why do we do that? And I think I made it a great job in our introduction, laying out sort of the baseline analysis of what the Olympics do to cities. They increase state violence, and we're having a moment in Los Angeles and America as a whole where we are reckoning with the impacts of violent policing. The Olympics create situations where there is massive displacing impacts and also massive over-policing of unhoused populations and populations living in informal settlements. This is being massively exacerbated by the Olympic Games in Los Angeles, or not by the Olympic Games, I apologize, by COVID currently in Los Angeles. The environmental degradation piece. A big piece of the Olympics is increasing the vulnerability to catastrophe, and that relates both to the environment and also to the notion of corruption and budgets and overspending and the underestimation of risk. These are all elements that COVID has sort of laid bare and been able to highlight for us the ways in which our analysis applies to the LA28 project. But we've also framed it through what's been happening in Tokyo, and I'm sure Itani is going to get into this in more depth. But what we've seen is the puncturing of the myth of the low-risk Olympics. There's been a lot of talk by the IOC in advance of the Tokyo 2020 Games that it was in safe hands when compared to some of the previous hosts. We've known that to be false, and I think that between Fukushima and now COVID, we've seen that there is no such thing as a safe host for the Olympics. Part of that is the reliance on tourism. Part of that is the lotteryism and the notion that so much is left up to chance when it comes to hosting the Olympics and then what the impact of an Olympics will be on your cities. But also it comes down to the fundamental corrupting nature of the Olympic Games. I think we've also pierced the recovery narrative myth, as Tokyo 2020 was supposed to be a recovery narrative around Fukushima. Now it's pivoting to be about COVID, but I think for us, that highlights that this isn't really about recovery. This is about consolidating wealth and power in the hands of a few. And also just the straight up dangers to the community. And again, I'll let Itani talk about that more, but it is another year of prioritizing the Olympic Games in terms of planning and policy. In LA, what we've seen is we've had this moment in terms of the George Floyd uprising. 1984, the Olympics were in Los Angeles, and the most pernicious legacy they left was an increasingly militarized police force with tanks, with a massively expanded helicopter arsenal, with at what were at the time state-of-the-art surveillance techniques that led to massive gang sweeps and violence on Black and brown communities in Los Angeles. This is reaffirmed as a front for organizing for us, this uprising and the BLM movement as a whole. We are now organizing more passionately than ever around what we've always known to be our core analysis, that LA28 will lead to over-policing once again in these vulnerable communities. We also had unprecedented fires this summer that sort of coincided with COVID. They actually were happening on SoFi Stadium's opening day, SoFi Stadium being our big new NFL stadium that would be used for the opening ceremonies of the games if the Olympics are allowed to proceed. I think this speaks to the idea that the myth that LA Olympics are safe. Eric Garcetti, our mayor, has said that UCLA will, of course, be here in 2028. UCLA's campus was shut down for multiple reasons this year. Both COVID and the fires have shut down the campus. When you talk about the Olympic Games, they happen over 2 weeks. There is no safe way to host the Olympic Games. And the massive delays related to SoFi, the absence of audience there, has meant over $5 billion in losses already for the developer of that stadium. Fortunately, that is falling on the owner of the Rams, Stan Kroenke. But if you look at something like the Olympics, where a number of smaller venues would have to be developed for the games, the risk of cost overruns remains high. Finally, we have an exacerbated eviction and homelessness crisis. UCLA studies have shown that there are tens of thousands who are at risk of becoming homeless in the next 6 months and hundreds of thousands at risk of eviction. For us, this is core to our analysis. This is a crisis in Los Angeles of housing affordability and homelessness that needs to be directly addressed with every policy tool that we have. The Olympics provides a countervailing force to that, and therefore is not only a distraction from solving these crises, but is an impediment to solving these crises. Same in terms of police expansion, same in terms of resilience to disasters. And broadly speaking, what we've been able to organize around, though, is a frustration with the status quo. Figures like Eric Garcetti were previously popular and now broadly, frankly, unpopular. There was massive local electoral turnover and a mandate against the forms of violent policing that have been a major problem for the region for decades. And this was a testament to the work that Olympics and other orgs have done, but also tapped into a well of resentment that had long been under the surface. So to conclude, what are we doing right now? We are attempting to broaden our base through digital organizing tools and trying to keep ourselves and the affected populations as safe as possible. We're refocusing on our core analysis and issues, organizing around policing, displacement, and the budget in the wake of this mass civic education that is happening, while contributing our analysis to the civic education. And finally, and this is something that happened when we met with our allies in Japan last summer, we were reaffirmed in our analysis. We are correct. The Olympic Games should not happen. They are bad for host cities, and they would specifically be bad for Los Angeles for all the reasons that are being highlighted under COVID-19. And so with that, I'm going to conclude and hand it over to Itani.
Hello, good morning, everybody. This is Itani actually based in Osaka, Japan currently, but let me share the screen. I hope everybody can see the screen okay. So thank you for Amanda for inviting me to this talk. I have collaborated with Hangorin no Kai and Okotoba Link, who are a group of amazing activists who have been for a very long time since the bidding process for the Tokyo 2020 happened early 2010 to push back the Olympic disaster. Because I am not a member of these activist groups, I am today focused more on what's going on in Japan currently that is preparing for the Olympics next year and going through this disaster, the pandemic at the same time. And I want to, the title is, I decided to put the Olympic exceptionalism because there are a lot of things happening in Japan currently around the pandemic and preparation for the Olympics. And there are so many measures that are coming from the government that really treats Olympics as an exceptional place and space. When everybody in Japan are struggling economically and in health with the health disaster, Olympics has been by far probably most protected. And so this is the picture from the gathering from last year, back in 2019, July. And this banner, Olympics Kill the Poor, currently, I mean, it was very, it really touches the core of the Olympics, even then, but it feels even more and more real for a lot of people who are witnessing what's happening in Japan. So this is the current situation of the COVID-19 outbreak in Japan. The number might not seem too high compared to places like in the United States, But Japan does have quite high number of COVID cases, 19 cases in East Asia. And this, if you look at the numbers of the cases that are confirmed, Tokyo has the highest number. It has the biggest population in Japan, so it's probably not surprising. But if you look at other places where we are experiencing the highest spread, are major cities that attract the most tourists. And we know that the Olympics is the major tourist attraction. And the companies and in the government officials who are really pressing hard to keep the Olympics are strongly tied to the tourism industry. And this Hokkaido is the prefecture that is actually a big island, but the population is not as big, but it has a very large tourist destinations. And it is rumored to, or they are planning to bid for the 2030 Olympics. So we have this link of the COVID pandemics or the widespread conditions with the tourist attractions sites. And then Osaka is preparing for 2025 World Expo as well. So this is the graph that shows where have the highest number, and all these top cities are preparing for major events in the near future. And this is not an easy graph to understand. I borrowed it from other websites, but it shows the daily confirmed cases per million people and daily tests per million. The reason I have this here is Japan is sort of fitting into the average number of infections, but compared to other Asian nations such as South Korea or Taiwan that are similarly situated, the number of tests done in Japan remains very low. So there are still a lot of people who are waiting to be tested. Some people struggle with high fever for a week before the government or the city agrees to provide the test. So it is not still easy to get COVID-19 tests in Japan. And a lot of people are suffering without any medical care. And this is the budget for COVID-19 countermeasures. This is not just the Olympics. This is the Japanese overall. So the government announced that they are going to spend 25.5 trillion yen, which is roughly about 25 billion US dollars. And this is not as large compared to many other countries with the similar economic strength. But what's interesting here is that there is a big sum of money going to support family and businesses, but there is this 1.8 trillion yen is spent to prevent the spread of the infection and the development of medical care system and medicine, including vaccine. So compared to the economic stimulus package, this is about the same amount of money when this is really needed. Doctors and nurses are exhausted currently in Japan, and a lot of hospitals are not able to make profit because a lot of patients are not coming to hospitals because they are afraid of the infection. Okay. And compared to this whole package to sustain the nation basically for this during the pandemic, the budget plan for the Olympics is quite large. 1.3 trillion yen was the original budget for Tokyo 2020. And this is the official number. So everybody knows that this is probably twice higher in reality. And there is additional cost because the Olympics is postponed 1 year. And plus, now the organizer has to provide the countermeasures for the COVID-19. So 1.3 trillion yen was the original, but 294 billion yen additional for postponement. But this is the money that's costing the organizers, the host cities directly. And this does not include those cities that are hosting the training camps. And because the Tokyo 2020 is planned in the middle of the hottest part of summer, a lot of athletes were originally encouraged to arrive Japan early, at least a month earlier, so that their body is conditioned for the summer heat in Japan. So these cities must provide a lot of measures and do a lot of preventions for the COVID-19 to keep athletes, staffs, and other officials for up to a month or two in their own cities. And when we think about this, there is a lot of, so the Japan is hitting accel and brake about the COVID-19 at the same time. In the previous slide, I talked about there is a 1.7 trillion yen initiative to stimulate the economy. And this is called Go-To campaign. This is a bad naming, but so it involves traveling and eating out, both of which were highly discouraged, were not recommended if we want to really stop the spread of the infection. But Japan has provided this much money to help. Basically, this is a coupon provided to for those people who want to travel around Japan and eat out, namely to support the domestic tourism industry and food service industry. And the Go-To Travel began in July 22nd this year. It was just when the second wave of COVID was hitting Japan. And there were a lot of criticisms on this. And then people agreed that this probably shouldn't happen, but the government went for it anyway. And it was initially supposed to be ended by the end of the year or January at most, but the government just announced that they are going to extend this campaign till June, next year, June, basically until when the Olympics begins. Because they are expecting the Olympics will bring back the economy and bring more tourists. And another Go-To-Eat, this actually just started 2 months ago in October 1st. And this is also coinciding with the current third wave of the COVID-19. So these campaigns are clearly behind this driving force of the COVID-19 infections. And just now, just recently, there is medical communities, I'm sorry, my kitten might join us a bit. Tokyo Medical Association urged the government to pause this Go-To Travel campaign because this is clearly, there is a clear increase of infections because of this campaign. And just a few days ago, Osaka Prefecture and Asahikawa City, which is a city in Hokkaido, asked the central government to send nurses from the self-defense force. This is clearly showing that the cities cannot have more patients. They are medical care system is collapsing. And just yesterday, maybe the December 8th is still today for most of you. Again, Tokyo Medical Association warned the government with exhausted medical workers, they won't be able to sustain the medical care system. That's how pressing the situation currently is. So even without the COVID, the Olympics was a burden on medical workers. And this is the number of requested medical volunteers, not a paid work. These are volunteers before COVID-19, and over 5,000 medical workers, which is professionals, doctors and nurses and physical therapists, plus additional 5,000 regular volunteers who support these medical workers were requested for injuries, sudden illnesses, and heat stroke, which is a serious concern for the next year, and other medical emergencies. And this, again, does not include COVID-19 infection cases. So definitely we are going to need way more medical staff if we are going to have Olympics during the pandemic. And this is the planned COVID-19 countermeasures for Tokyo 2020 or 2021 currently. Initially, when the postponement was announced, the government and then the organizer tried to assure people here assure that it's going to be safe because there will be 2-week quarantine period, which is currently enforced for, not really enforced actually, required for any foreign visitors coming into Japan. But they are going to waive that 2-week period because it makes attending games too difficult because most likely people are not going to stay more than 2 weeks just to watch games. And there was initially, the government initially tried to say that all visitors will be vaccinated, but they just decided that no vaccination is going to be required for visitors also, because this is difficult to enforce and monitor. And during the stay, the athletes will be PCR tested twice a day. But as I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, people here are struggling to get tested, not to even being hospitalized. So there's clear exceptions for the athletes and IOC members. Anybody related to Olympics, they are not, they are given basically a special treatment. And earlier, Spike asked how people are going to be protected from the Olympics, but they are not going to be. The people who are protected are maybe the athletes and IOC members. And the people living in Japan is going to be exposed to more risks. And one of the last things that I want to touch upon in my presentation is the economic downturn, which is probably experienced in the most parts of the world currently because of this pandemic. But there is increasing research showing that this economic downturn has been impacting women workers in particular. In Japan, more than half of the working women are part-timers. So those are the people who are cut first when the company doesn't do well. And the COVID-19 particularly devastated service industries, and again, which largely relied on the part-time female workers. And this also includes a lot of sex workers. The Japanese government at the beginning of the pandemic specifically blamed this night business, including sex workers, for the spread of the COVID-19. So the customers are gradually coming back, perhaps thanks to the Go-To campaign. But this is one of the biggest areas that the economy is, that the hardship is hitting, and they are a majority of women. And there is a dramatic increase of suicide, particularly for women after summer. This is a number of deaths by suicide. Japan has notoriously high number of suicide around the world, but the past 10, 20 years, it was getting better. But we have the number coming back again sharply this year. So the light green is from last year and the darker green is from this year. So if you look at the January, February, March, and actually when the first wave of coronavirus and the pandemic hit, the number went down. Perhaps because there was a sense of urgency and sort of the togetherness in a way, we are all in this together. And yet, when the Go-To campaign started and people started to travel, eat out, and basically try to go back to the business as usual, which was July, you can see the number is started to go higher and higher. In October, it's one of the record high in recent years. And this is including all genders. But if you look at the breakdowns by gender, this the red line is the female. Oh, sorry, this is supposed to be 2020, and this is 2019. So you can see that both women and men number is going up, but the increase among women is much sharper. This is perhaps the precarious working condition among women in Japan, as well as domestic violence cases that are increasing around the world. So to conclude, there is no such a thing as a low risk Olympics. They can spend a lot of money to make the Olympics probably low risk for athletes and IOC, but definitely not people in the host cities, especially people who are economically vulnerable. And activists in Tokyo are right when they said the Olympics are a disaster, and they do kill, and they are killing particularly the poor people. Thank you.
Thank you, Itani and Spike and Amanda for the invitation. I'm so honored to be a part of this panel with so many amazing people and see how much overlap there is between our different contexts. I'm going to be speaking about Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, which was the host of the Olympics in 2016 and also the host of the World Cup in 2014. And so today, I'm going to kind of bring experiences from both of these mega events. This photograph that I put here says the Olympics bring more than the Olympics, which I think is, as we've been hearing, as we all know, that's the case in so many different areas, especially when we want to, when talking about violence and abuses, and especially of sex workers, as Itani just mentioned, are often scapegoats, especially when thinking about things like HIV and COVID-19. And here in Brazil, unfortunately, the the large sporting events also coincided with a rising wave of conservatism and reactionary far-right politics, which culminated in the election of Jair Bolsonaro in 2018, who's now infamous around the world for his no response to the COVID-19 pandemic here. And that also coincided with the decrease in investment in sex worker rights. And so there are a bunch of kind of different factors going on here. And I wanted to share a little bit of this context before getting into COVID-19 and what's happening here now, especially to talk a little bit about what happened during these events. And then I'll get to focusing on the mobilization around COVID-19. And I'm going to focus a lot on the collective that I'm part of, which is the Collective Puta da Vida, and also the Casa Nem, which is a trans LGBT occupation here, an urban occupation, and also a project that is created as a cultural and social space and connected to a lot of different social movements here. And so to start, I just want to give a little bit of a context of, there we go, of Brazil's history in terms of sex worker activism. It has a long history. It started in the 1970s, the first protest, and it was about police violence, which is something that continues today and something that was a major issue in Brazil also during the World Cup and during the Olympics, although worse during the World Cup. And the movement here in the middle is Gabriela Silva Leite, who's founded the movement, was Lourdes Barreto, that's here in the bottom left-hand corner looking at the screen, founded an NGO called GEMPAC. And as you can see, of course, this is all in Portuguese, but the activism really has always been very much around focusing on fighting state violence, specifically police violence in areas of prostitution. Prostitution is not illegal in Brazil, although it is not regulated. So everything around it is illegal. And the police have a way, something that I've worked a lot with my colleagues at the Federal University of Rio, and a research group that we have called the Prostitution Policy Watch, is looking at how this state, what this has meant in terms of how the state regulates prostitution, which means that they can kind of decide when and how they want to intervene and use all the laws surrounding prostitution to arrest sex workers, which is what happened in the World Cup. So as my colleague Tadeusz Blanchetti, who also works closely with Amanda, frequently says, it's actually not correct to say prostitution is legal in Brazil, because in fact, all of the illegalities that surround it are what make so much police violence possible, and it has historically, and it's what made it very possible also as well during the World Cup. And so this is the background, and also the HIV epidemic, which the sex worker movement started in the late 80s. And so it coincided both with Brazil's redemocratization process after 3 decades of dictatorship, and also the HIV epidemic. And like all around the world, prostitutes were, we say also, I should contextualize that in Brazil, the sex worker movement here actually uses the word prostitute as a way to kind of reclaim the stigma around the word. And so I know that in other contexts, it is not, it's seen as a very negative and derogatory term, but in fact here, it's the preferred term of the movement, along with whore, puta. And so I tried to say sex workers because I know that in English it has prostitute rings differently, but sometimes I'll say it. And here, in the whole movement has been built around this idea of not being ashamed of being a sex worker. And so a lot of the work is about that was all, the whole HIV prevention campaign was also really built on this idea of not having shame about your profession, that sex work is work, and that the only way to fight stigma around prostitution was really to get at the core of the stigma about selling sex for money. And so Lourdes Barreto and Gabriela were really at the forefront of this. And at the time, as I say in the title of the presentation is Shining a Red Light on State Absences and Abuses, the state often has been quite absent when it comes to sex worker rights. And so in the case also of HIV prevention, first sex workers were scapegoated, and then they strongly protested that. And they were called to be partners with the state and built a partnership where they were out in the field and out on the front lines, out on the street corners doing prevention, and all around this idea, an affirmative idea of sex work as work. And sex work is actually then recognized even as a profession in Brazil, according to the Ministry of Employment in 2002, which was a major gain for the movement. So this is kind of the background also, and very important for us to think about as well, what's been happening around COVID, this idea of sex workers mobilizing and really being at the front lines when the state is not present with the population. And then what happens is, so we fast forward now many decades, it's such a quick presentation. So now here we are in 2014, and we see that stigma and police violence still continue to be two of the main issues that the movement is confronting. And so there was a big, 2014 was the World Cup in Brazil. There were lots of protests around it and against it. This idea of, we won't have a World Cup, massive protests, and also there were protests of sex workers. It was a time where, because of these urban cleanup campaigns, many groups were being, everything that Spike is talking about was happening here. And sex workers specifically in Niterói, there was a raid where sex workers were renting apartments, which is where this photograph is from, with the crime scene tape. And before that, sex workers had just been protesting a few weeks earlier saying, we want to work, we don't want to go to prison, because the police had been illegally arresting sex workers in the same building. And then after the protests came and had a huge raid where over 160 women were wrongfully arrested without any warrants. Women were raped, all of their belongings stolen, the apartments where they were working were destroyed. It was terrible, and Davida was very closely involved in protests after that. This is one that was protesting the police raid. This is on May 31st, 2014. This is Indianara Siqueira, who I'll be talking more about as well. She's the founder of the Casanim project that I'm going to focus on, the trans project. And here she is, and there was a Das Pu. Part of what Davida does is we also have a clothing line that's called Das Pu, which means of the whores. And for the World Cup, we had a special collection. And Das Pu is something that uses a lot of playing on things. It's a very playful approach to protest and a playful approach to fashion. And so, although it's very serious, at the same time, there's a certain lightness to the protest. And for example, this banner at the bottom says, "We want red light districts that are FIFA standards," because there was a big thing about Brazil about everything having to be FIFA standards. So there were these protests, around this police violence and using the kind of corporal, body activism and art, and all the different ways that sex workers have been organizing now here for decades to fight this and to bring media attention to it, which is something that Das Pu as a clothing line has very successfully done. And so then we come, so this happens to this day. There's been no justice for these police raids that happened in 2014. They've been, the women that did come forward were threatened. This is something that we can talk more about because there's not a lot of time here. And Amanda also accompanied all of this and knows a lot about what happened after the World Cup here. And then come the Olympics, which were a time where there was actually less police violence towards sex workers than during the World Cup, which on some hand we think happened because the really massive kind of cleanup campaigns happened before the World Cup here in Rio de Janeiro. And also because of the activism, there was a lot of speaking out and everything that happened, with the sex worker movement here because of what happened with the World Cup, and especially around this issue of trafficking. And so what happened, there was always huge media, as you can see here, big headlines before these mega events, that they're going to bring droves of sex tourists, that it's, there'll be minors being trafficked in from all over the world and all over Brazil. These issues, associating prostitution with violence and crime, this shocking world, these images that always show sex workers with their faces hidden, or in the case of this bottom image, the first images of these sex workers that are holding the signs with the Olympic rings were actually taken by a religious NGO that told them that their photographs would not appear, and then they circulated online. And so completely unethical practices with images and these sensationalist headlines that, aside from not being based in any sort of fact, also really contribute to increasing both violence and stigma around sex work. And as sex workers frequently say, what they, Indianara Siqueira is always saying that what she most would like is for airplanes of sex tourists to be coming to Brazil. You know, it's their work, and so they're interested in earning money. And so it's this idea that there would be more clients for a lot of sex workers is not a negative thing. And that in and of itself breaks down a lot of stereotypes and things that people think about sex work and mega events. But because of these kind of unethical and really criminal uses of sex worker images, we worked on a project that Amanda is going to share links to, because there isn't a lot of time to talk about it here, but where sex worker coordinators recruited women from different areas of Rio de Janeiro to take pictures and document their daily lives, and to show, you know, what is it really like to work in sex work during the Olympic Games, what really happens. And so we have the project, which was given a name by one of the sex workers, is What You Don't See, Prostitution as We See It. And a lot of the images, you know, just like has happened in South Africa, just like what happened, you know, in the UK, there was not an increase. There was, in fact, hardly any clients. A lot of the sex workers complained, all of them really complained about the areas where they were working as being empty, not, you know, having droves of tourists, not getting work. And their images were just, you know, of daily lives. And so it's a real counterpoint to the kind of sensationalist journalist perspective of prostitution, and really, you know, getting at this idea of stigmas. This one says, "Puta também lê Bukowski," whores also read Bukowski, whores also go to protests. And so really breaking down stigma and ideas around prostitution. They shared images through WhatsApp. And so these are kind of images from the WhatsApp group. And what I wanted to focus on right now is to take a look at the Casa Nem project for this last third of the presentation. The Casa Nem also participated in the What You Don't See project, and Dionara Siqueira was one of the main organizers. And this was the Casa Nem occupation from 2016 to 2018. And so this was in a downtown area of Rio de Janeiro called Lapa, which is an area historically known for sex work and still an area of a lot of trans sex work. And this is the Casa Nem house, which was started as a project to train trans men and women for the entrance exam to Brazil's public universities here, and evolved into a space for all sorts of other kinds of trainings and cultural activities. And during the Olympics, actually, and the photographs here, this is by Evelyn Guterres, who was one of the photographers. And during the Olympics, the Casa Nem was actually was the Pride House. And so it became a space that was incorporated even into the Olympics landscape, and Casa Nem residents were volunteers. So Evelyn was a volunteer, Sabrina was a volunteer, and these are some of the pictures that they took during the Olympic events. I see my time, and so I'm gonna jump here, but just again, this is all things that are also available on the website for more images of the Casa Nem, kind of what happened around the Olympics. Evelyn and Ludmila, who's in the photo with the statue, joked that these were the only sex tourists that they were seeing, were these mannequins. So here now for this last part, I'm going to focus on COVID. Bolsonaro has been, you know, notorious around the world for his irresponsible and just completely polarizing way of dealing with the pandemic, very similar to Trump. This is a graffiti of him. There was a photo famous of him trying to take off the mask or put it on. Through this polarization in Brazil, there were large protests of people saying, you know, calling even for armed interventions to bring back the dictatorship, to close the Supreme Court. So responsibility for the epidemic has been placed everywhere except on the federal government. And so states and municipalities have had to really take a front role. Nearly 180,000 people have died in Brazil. We have more cases and deaths than any country after the United States. And it's just been a complete lack of leadership. Rio de Janeiro's governor is currently being impeached because of a big corruption scandal over stealing money from that was supposed to go for respirators. And so the group, what has this meant for sex workers and the groups that I've been working with? The Coletiva Puta da Vida, we went online, like everyone here. Sex workers, as Itani also mentioned, you know, it was been devastating for them, and there was a big need to have campaigns to raise money. And so there are 3 national networks in Brazil. Coletiva da Vida is part of the Brazilian Prostitute Network, and it came together with the other 2 national networks to create a large campaign and put out information about ways to support sex workers. the Colectivo Puta da Vida started an Instagram page. We actually didn't have one. And we had just decided to become a collective, to go from and it was called an NGO de Vida. And then right before the pandemic, there was a decision to turn more into an organization as a collective. And so the pandemic kind of forced us to get online, which has been good in many ways. In fact, this image also at the bottom is of an International Prostitutes Day, right? International Prostitutes Rights Day, which is June 2nd. And there are leaders from all over Brazil that are here, colleagues of mine, also Prostitution Polish, Ana Paula da Silva, Soraya Simões, Lourdes is here, who I showed at the beginning. So anyway, there was a way also really, because usually events to bring sex workers together from all over Brazil are quite expensive. And so being online has been interesting because while of course it's been, prohibitive in many ways, there were solidarity networks that were formed quickly from these groups. And the Casa Nem in particular has been very important for doing this kind of frontline work. So here, the Casa Nem was evicted of the previous location where they were during the Olympics and went to a location in Copacabana, which is kind of Rio de Janeiro's postcard area, and they delivered they call them cestas básicas, which are kind of basic, meals and rice and beans, food oil, things to cook to people, both mainly the LGBT population, also the street population, people that live in the outskirts and the favelas of Rio de Janeiro. And we see these very interesting partnerships being formed. So once again, sex workers, just like around HIV, are really at the front lines and filling in these absences of the state. So they're out, they're taking, this bottom photograph is of Jesus Marino, who's in Maranhão, which is in Brazil's northeast. She's been tirelessly organizing along with a group that's another collective there that's about empowered women that everyone is wearing the t-shirt from here. Here's Lourdes Barreto, and these are women also that are part of risk groups, but they're out on the front lines. Again, they're sex workers. They're the ones, again, just like I said, really filling in these complete absences and responsibilities from the state. And at the bottom here, we see sex workers also giving goods and things in the Vila Mimosa. And so just to finish up, because I know now that my time is up, but I wanted to end with this example of the Casa Nem, that in the middle of the pandemic, even though they'd had some partnerships with some of these state forces, they were evicted from the occupation that they were in Copacabana. And so this is the day that it was evicted. It was an event, lots of people organized. They formed a human barrier, but they were able to pressure the state at this time to give them a permanent space. And so there's also, Brazil, there's a joke here that Brazil isn't a place for beginners. And so we see that at this time also in this state where there was a governor that really supported the president. He's from the far right, mostly a despicable person, but at the same time, the state government gave the Casa Nem a permanent space. And it wasn't given, this is because the Casa Nem has been fighting for 5 years to have a permanent space. And so we see at this moment that they were able to get that. So they were evicted from Copacabana, and here we see them, with the Rio de Janeiro state now getting a permanent space for their shelter for trans and LGBT community here. And so this is something that's positive that's happened, and Amanda asked to talk a little bit about as well about what we see as continuing on even after, hopefully, there's a vaccine when the pandemic ends. And I think, there was the sustainability that recognized the Casa Nem's long fight, and the Colectivo Puta da Vida also has reached out and even grown during the pandemic because of our more online presence that has connected us to sex workers that before we weren't. And so I'll just end here and then apologize if that was a little rushed, but we'll have time for questions where I can speak more. And there's my contact and our Instagram, and also the Casa Nem has an active campaign. And so I encourage people that can and that are interested also to donate to all the amazing work that they're continuing to do around COVID, and also to support the trans community in Rio. Thank you.
Kwekwe, Watsi, Lekwungen, West Saanich. Hello and greetings from the territories of the Lekwungen and West Saanich people. I just want to begin today by thanking Amanda, William, and everyone at City Institute for inviting me onto this very exciting panel, and I'm really happy to be with this group of incredible scholars and activists. There has, I think, so much important information shared across presentations, and I think it's quite incredible to see a lot of the consistent concerns coming out of so many of our past Olympic cities and future Olympic cities. What I want to focus on today, I am going to be focusing on the Vancouver 2010 Games. And I am a historian, so trying to make the linkages between past resistance movements and how that looks moving forward. Hopefully I can pull together some thoughts around some of the resistance efforts related to the 2010 Games. And how they particularly might impact future plans to host the Games in Canada, and specifically the impacts it could potentially have on Indigenous peoples and First Nations throughout Canada. And so where I want to begin, I want to begin by recognizing that much of the resistance and coordination around the 2010 Vancouver Games was organized through the Olympic Resistance Network, ORN. And they adopted the slogan, "No Olympics on Stolen Native Land." And this was really the central focus point for all resistance. I think a lot of the concerned entities within the resistance movement recognize this slogan as the foundation of their resistance efforts. And so I want to highlight why this became such an important focal point as it related to the Vancouver Games, specifically recognizing some of the history. I told Amanda a few weeks ago, sometimes I have a habit of going too far into Olympic history and not so much on centered on sport and Olympic focus, but I want to provide context because this is really important in terms of the Vancouver Olympic Games and why this campaign became so central to the resistance movement. And as you can see from this map here, all of the areas that are color-coded in purple, green, pinks, this yellowy orange, these are all the historical treaties in Canada. So beginning in 1701, right up until 1923, the British Crown and later the Canadian government negotiated historical treaties. And as you can see here, where my cursor is British Columbia. There is a significant absence of treaties. And so there are very few treaties that were negotiated in British Columbia. There are here on Vancouver Island, where I am currently residing on Lekwungen and West Saanich territory, what are called the Douglas Treaties, negotiated between 1850 and 1854. And here we have part of northeastern British Columbia that was negotiated into Treaty 8 in 1899. And this was partly due to interest in the gold rush in the late 1800s into this region. But other than that, the province has essentially, since the time it became a part of Canada in 1871 to the 1990s, ignored the issue of Aboriginal title, Aboriginal rights to land. And so it has proactively denied Indigenous rights in the country. And so this exists in the form of legal claims and has been very proactive in the oppression and marginalization of Indigenous peoples. And so it wasn't until 1993 when the province was essentially forced by the Canadian High Courts, the Supreme Court of Canada, and various high courts throughout British Columbia to address the question of Aboriginal title. And so in 1993, the British Columbia Treaty Commission was established to deal with the question of treaty in British Columbia. And the task was to negotiate treaties or land claims moving forward. And so the Olympic bid in 1999 that moved forward out of BC for the Vancouver Games was really, a lot of my work centers on the fact that this bid was in response to a lot of legal uncertainty throughout the province related to Native land claims. And the political and corporate elite were eager to bring more certainty to the province. And so they saw the Olympic bid as an opportunity to bring back investment in industry and tourism and resort development back into British Columbia. And so they moved this bid forward. The Games were eventually awarded to Vancouver in 2003. And it's really important to point out that, well, almost to the point when the Games were opened, in February 2010, There were no land claims that were reached through the British Columbia Treaty Commission. So almost 2 decades into the activity of the commission, the province had yet to negotiate a land claim. The first one was actually the Tsawwassen land claim negotiated in 2009, right before the Olympics opened. And this was largely in response to the fact that Tsawwassen threatened to shut down the ports. So they are a major freight port and passenger port connecting Vancouver to Vancouver Island and to more global spaces. And so that was the first land claim that was negotiated. And even since then, here we are in 2010, there have only been 3 land claims that have been negotiated. And so there's been a lot of concerns in British Columbia and Canada more generally about this fraudulent treaty process that we are currently experiencing. And so that was really what was at the heart of protest and resistance related to the games. I think a lot of concerned citizens and groups attached themselves to the No Olympics on Stolen Native Land campaign. And I just want to highlight a few other important aspects as it related to concerns. Jules Boykoff does some great work on this related to 2010 as well as 2012 in activism and the Olympics. But just to highlight a few points, I want to highlight that there was a lot of concern related to resistance coming out of environmental groups concerned with environmental destruction. And so they were concerned with the clear cuts and logging, mountain blasting, road construction through ecologically sensitive wetlands, gravel mining that resulted in damage to fish stocks, threats to animal populations, and its expanded infrastructure for mining, logging, oil and gas, ski resorts, and tourisms. And one of the most, I think, heartbreaking aspects of this as related to Indigenous rights and environmental destruction was the death of Nuu-chah-nulth hereditary leader Harriet Nahaney, who was protesting the expansion of the Sea to Sky Highway through the ecologically sensitive wetlands going between Vancouver and Whistler. And so she was arrested and jailed, and as a result of her jailing, she got quite ill and had to be hospitalized, and a few days later she died. And so there's a direct linkage between this activism and the death of a respected Nuu-chah-nulth or First Nations leader. Some of the other concerns were, I think, consistent with much of the Olympic resistance, concerns around security and eroding civil rights. And so there was mounting concerns about increased political repression and security. Vancouver City Council followed the IOC's request to create an environment free of protest by enhancing bylaws to restrict posters, signs, leaflets, marches, noisemakers, and any possible, quote, disturbance to Olympic entertainment. There was a corporatization that I think is consistent across all Olympic planning. Damage to communities, and specifically in the context of Vancouver, very much targeted to the downtown east side. Where there is a very high Indigenous population as well as a high sex worker population. And so the downtown east side was very much targeted, and the lack of affordable housing became a significant concern. And in Canada, there is a very clear insecurity around public costs and debts, and that is very much attributed to the 1976 Montreal Games, and the debt for the 1976 Games wasn't paid off until 2002. So there was a lot of uncertainty around public costs and debts that would be, no doubt, be a part of the fabric of these games. Another important aspect to these games, and I want to link it into what we're talking about here on global diseases, and I think that this is something that has been overshadowed or is not a very known aspect of these games, but that was the 2009 H1N1 global pandemic. And this is something that was a significant concern in the months leading up to the Vancouver Games, as the global pandemic was sort of came to be less than a year prior to the hosting of these games. And just to highlight some of the timeline here, so the global the response in British Columbia began in April 2009. And so with the first wave of the pandemic coming out of the United States, the province of British Columbia health officials began to plan for potential global pandemic, recognizing that it was the host of the Olympic Games in less than a year. So began to respond, and it began to respond by increasing the stockpile of antiviral drugs available in the province. So they boosted the supply by 3 million, so from 7 million to 3 million, to make sure that there was enough antiviral drugs. A particular concern in the Olympic context was the uniqueness of the viral, in that it was not only highly contagious and spread quickly from person to person, but it was unique in that it most directly affected children over the age of 5, youth, and young adults. And so this was a significant concern in the Olympic context, and in terms of the majority of Olympic athletes being in these age brackets. WHO declared an official global pandemic in June 2009 and started to work very closely with the Vancouver organizers, actually sending WHO officials to Vancouver in November of 2009. And VANOC, the organizing committee, began to coordinate a vaccine program immediately. So they insisted that all staff and volunteers for the Games be vaccinated. They recommended to all National Olympic Committees that the athletes and officials get vaccinated prior to arriving in Vancouver, encouraging international visitors to be vaccinated as well. And they also provided all visitors H1N1 shots upon arrival. This was a bit of a concern in that it was, I believe it was 7 to 10 days for the antibodies to be built up within the system. So it was highly encouraged that everyone coming into Vancouver or into Canada would receive the shot prior to entering. An interesting aspect of this is the fact that the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Force had established an integrated security unit. And this security unit was responsible for all aspects related to policing and security. And they became responsible for a potential H1N1 outbreak in the hosting of the Games. And I just wanted to highlight this in terms of policing and security as it related to these Games. This division of the RCMP was formed in 2003 to coordinate security planning and operations for these Games. It has since been used and or reactivated for events in Canada, such as the 2009 World Police and Fire Games, 2010 G8 and G20 summits, the 2015 Pan American Games in Toronto, and the 2019 G7 summit. And so initially when this unit was established for the Vancouver Games, the budget was 175 million Canadian, and it ended up being over 900 million Canadian, and there was an additional 100 million that was committed to private police forcing. And overall, it consisted of approximately 16,000 police, military, and private security personnel. And in the end, the fears about H1N1 were never realized. There was a lot of work done within the organizing committee and in BC health planning to respond to this, but no outbreak took place and there was no concern related to the Games. Just I'll quickly go through some of the connections that I want to make between these Games and the future hosting of the Games potentially in Vancouver. Some of you are probably aware of the fact that Vancouver is interested in bidding for the Winter Games once again in 2030. And so they are putting various bids through Vancouver City Council, and it's at the initiative of John Furlong, who was the CEO of the Vancouver Organizing Committee. And so he has, beginning in February 2020, started to initiate this through City Council. It has been put on pause, or it was put on pause initially due to the COVID pandemic outbreak. And in April, they canceled the meeting where the motion was to be heard. And just recently, within the last month, Vancouver City Council has voted to postpone discussions to early 2021 about whether or not it would be feasible to host, or it would be desirable to host the 2030 Games. And I just want to put this in the context that now the discussions, it's my understanding what's happening currently within these political circles within Vancouver, is they have spun the decisions to respond to the COVID pandemic, and suggesting city councillors, John Furlong, are suggesting that the decision to move forward with a bid proposal is now being framed around British Columbia's long-term economic and tourism recovery from COVID-19. So that is one way in which it has been spun. Beyond the opportunities for economic development and tourism growth, John Furlong has further suggested that in the aftermath of the COVID-19 global pandemic, the hosting of the 2030 Olympic Games in Vancouver will serve, quote, as an inspiration for the city. And so while the conception of this potential bid happened before the COVID-19 pandemic, it has now been reframed in a way to be responsive to the global pandemic a decade down the road. And in terms of linking this back into Indigenous rights and Indigenous involvement, it's already been acknowledged by the Mayor of Vancouver, Kennedy Stewart. He has indicated that not only would there be a need to be heightened involvement from the Lil'wat, Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, these are the 4 host nations from the 2010 Games, but they would have to be the lead in the bid committee. And this is where some of my more recent work on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. I've been working on this call to action 91. There's 94 calls to action for how reconciliation can be achieved in Canada. And they have named Olympic, Pan Am, and Commonwealth Games as a call to action item. And one of my concerns right here is that the interest is in ensuring that Indigenous peoples' territorial protocols are respected and local Indigenous communities are engaged in all aspects of planning and participating in such events. And my work is centering on, I spent the last couple of years working against the potential Calgary bid for the 2026 game. And it looks like I might have some work to do here on 2030 in terms of that there is no, I argue that there's no way to ensure Indigenous peoples' territorial protocols are respected, particularly in the absence of treaties which have yet to be negotiated in the territories of the host nations, which would be the Lil'wat, Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. And finally, I just want to finish off by highlighting some work that is currently being done, particularly out of the Yellowhead Institute at Ryerson University, and as figures are coming in about what COVID-19 has meant for Indigenous communities, it is becoming increasingly clear that Indigenous peoples throughout settler colonial Canada are particularly vulnerable to these diseases. Historical and ongoing structural asymmetries remain as they relate to the administration of health services, environmental racism, and inaccessibility to healthy food sources for Indigenous peoples. The COVID-19 has also drawn attention to the dysfunctional relationship between federal, provincial, and Indigenous governments, specifically a lack of transparency, communication, and cooperation in pandemic support planning and implementation. And so I think that we now, with these numbers coming out as a result of COVID-19, and we see how vulnerable Indigenous communities are and how little attention and resources have been put into Indigenous communities, that there is an added layer of complexity for cities such as Vancouver or Calgary who wish to go forward for a potential bid for the Olympic Games. And what I question whether or not it's possible in this day and age to host the Olympic Games, whether it be on ceded treaty Indigenous territories or unceded Indigenous territories. And so I think that looking at the vulnerability of Indigenous communities and considering Indigenous rights, there's strong arguments to be made that this is not plausible moving forward. So I will leave it there, and I look forward to the chat.
Thank you so much, everyone. Such interesting presentations, and really I was trying to preemptively think of potential questions to ask during the day, and you've all given me so much more to think about and think about now that that I hadn't initially anticipated. So I appreciate that so much, and thank you. I've included now in the chat for everyone to now hopefully see access to some of your open access articles. So you can access that Google document and be able to flip through some of the awesome work from all the panelists and presenters today. So the one thing that I was thinking of, and because I'm seeing that there's no questions in the Q&A, and given that we only have such a tight amount of time left, there's only 8 minutes left to the webinar. One of the things I wanted to ask you, maybe if I could, in terms of future directions of our work, I know that we talked about organizing with communities, and I was wondering, in terms of your own research, how your work has been affected by COVID-19 and how you plan to navigate the future of your potential interests or questions now.
I can jump in and start, because I think that's sort of where I left it in my presentation, was that in Canada, there is a strong emphasis on, and through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, that Indigenous rights need to be respected in the future planning of mega sporting events. And I question that. And I think as more information comes out, as we start to see how it become more exposed in terms of the fact that the government hasn't done a good job in protecting First Nations and Indigenous people, that this becomes an extension of Indigenous rights, and the health services that are required by the government, access to healthy food, food security, and all those sorts of things will become part of the broader conversation. So I think time will tell, but this is going to be an extension of Indigenous rights, I think, in the Canadian context.
Yeah, I think in the American context, Indigenous rights intersect, especially in Los Angeles, with segregation and land, who owns what land, who controls what land as a whole. And in terms of next steps in research, adjacent to UCLA's campus is the VA facility, which was sort of land granted to the federal government to provide housing and support services for veterans. That's since been like subleased out to local academic institutions. What is forgotten in that history is the post-Civil War like land claiming that happened that allowed for the land granting in the first place, and the erasure of the Indigenous history that precedes all of this work, before we get to the modern sort of social justice implications of, largely Black and Latinx communities living on the streets outside of the Veterans Administration. So for us, it has to inform any understanding when we talk about land. It cannot be erased or ignored. And we have to engage with it with direct harm mitigation as organizers for the communities that are being oppressed now. So it definitely complicates any sort of like basic analysis of like what we can do and what we should do, but it is really important, and it's research that we are doing and is ongoing in our sphere.
One of the things that because I am not a part of activist group, I'm just collaborating. I can't speak on behalf of their organizing, but I just want to point out two things, how the COVID is impacting the anti-Olympic efforts is, one, this has been a sort of a chance in a weird way that people are realizing how much Japanese government and the organizing committee are spending money to host this 2 weeks Olympics, or if you include the Paralympics, it's a month-long effort, but it's just one just sport event. And many of the other sporting events have been canceled. High school baseballs, all the amateur events are closed. A lot of fitness centers, sports places are closed, but somehow the Olympic is going forward. And I just saw a question from a Q&A chat about how the athletes who are social justice minded can support the effort, but sorry, now the Olympic is happening. But so there was last month, or no, actually already in October, a famous gold medalist gymnast from Japan, Uchimura Kohei, was tested positive for the COVID-19. And he subsequently got tested twice more until the test result was negative. And then it was partly because he was going into this test event, international test event. So his presence was essential and his positive result was devastating. So he got 3 tests in a very short amount of time when people were not getting tested. And he actually after that pleaded people to be creative and support the Olympic effort, but the people's response has been, no, you are given a special treatment. And we clear, the Olympic athletes are this privileged group of people, and the people's willingness to support this effort is diminishing. So for me, the answer is if the athletes really do care about their future or the career, or the people in general, they really have to understand what people are going through outside of sporting event that has been this exceptional space. So yeah, that's it.
I think that here in the Brazilian context, one thing, and I'm thinking mostly a lot of the work that we've been doing has been more focused now kind of, on the pandemic. And, as it has in so many countries, it's really laid bare the extreme inequality in Brazil. And also it was a country that had been for over the past decade, kind of these neoliberal economic policies just destroying workers' protection, social security, safety networks. And so the pandemic hit in a moment when the state structure has been, being eroded over the past decade now, and particularly hard hit since 2016 when Dilma Rousseff was impeached and what a lot of people, including me, denounce as a soft coup. And so I think that one thing that we've been thinking a lot about is work and what, the fact that sex work isn't regulated as work has meant. And so a lot of kind of thinking with the movement, there've been a lot of, we call them lives here, the liveys on Instagram or Facebook or, and I think that isn't something that's been interesting because a lot of people didn't have access, sex workers' voices, although there's a strong movement. This kind of online virtual world, I think, has helped to expand access in some way for the, to the women, which is what's most important is them speaking for themselves. And so, issues around work and also violence, because also, as others have spoken about, increases in domestic violence during COVID-19 has also affected sex workers and other forms of violence. Those are kind of the 2 main issues, the movement. And personally, I've been also working on the project of the archives. Davida has an archive of over 30 years of their history that Gabriella started, and that's now in a public archive. And history is also really being attacked here. So Christine, we need, we're trying to make also international connection with historians, and this is this incredible archive of the history of the movement. So as a kind of, from a documentary making perspective, it was a project that I had long been dreaming of. I worked very closely with Gabriella on the donation process of the archive, and through the university that I'm at now, we're starting an extension project to work with students and sex workers to kind of get the archive out there. And that was one thing with the Colectivo Puta da Vida is our Instagram. We've actually, since we're not out right now, in the streets as much, we've been using archival images. And this has been interesting. It's been a way to kind of get them out on Instagram, and then different people write texts about the images. And so also kind of turning to history and archive and using this moment to get also to circulate these discourses in the virtual world, social media.
Because we're coming up on time, it's 8:31 now, so we are 1 minute over. There is one more question though from my PhD supervisor, so I feel obliged to ask it. And it is a great question. So Caroline Fusco is wondering, what is the response to all the critiquing and the organizing? Are you subjected to pressure from your academic institutions or local governments? And I'm thinking, I think Caroline's question goes on, but even though kind of the work has been moved online, is there also, the potential for that bulk data collection or surveillance happening on the level of the internet and people being made target that way as well? Have you personally experienced any of that? Do you feel silenced at times? And what keeps you going? Those are big questions. A great questions to end on. So with that, I will leave it to you.
Okay, I can start because I'm feeling a lot of pressures currently. I try to host some events in my university that has the Olympics, the World Olympics in the title of the event. And clearly I took a more critical approach, and my university top people approached me to change the title. And I was forced to call it sports mega events instead of the Olympics. That's one of the small examples of a lot of institutional pressures. And especially in the sports research field, a lot of funding for research comes from the Olympic related organizations, including JOs. So yes, if you are critical of the Olympics, the chances of your research getting funded in Japan is way smaller. And two of my colleagues who are fantastic scholar critiquing the Olympics, two of them have been basically like a quote unquote expelled from sports sociology conference. So there is that. So I'll just stop here.
I'll just say that here in Brazil, because the Olympics is passed, but one thing is a lot of professors who are critical of the government have had to be, the government has been increasingly, there's been surveillance of certain professors being fired because of political views. We're public servants. And so I was recently hired, so I'm in a particularly precarious position. At the same time, I'm very lucky because I'm in a leftist leaning department on political policy and, in public policy, and human rights. And so my colleagues are extremely supportive. But I think the overall environment, and also as part of these economic policies that, are trying to trim down and call professors parasites, there's just been a lot of very negative kind of actions by the government towards public education, and so I think it's interesting here because sex workers actually, and this is something that the Prostitution Policy Watch has been also talking a lot about, in some ways are better off in this government because they're not being targeted as they were in previous governments. Everyone is kind of just being left alone in some ways, that because they're targeting huge groups like education, professors. And so it's just like they've widened the net to such an extent that some populations are being less targeted. That's not the case though with the trans population. And so of course, trans sex worker, there's still high levels of violence, but this is such a reactionary government that the net has been really widened in terms of who they're going after. So I think professors are being persecuted in some contexts. But because of our work, I personally haven't felt that.
Yeah, I was fairly fortunate in my time at UCLA to work with Professor Anani Roy in the Institute on Inequality and Democracy, where these sorts of concerns weren't just allowed, but supported actively through the institution. That said, UCLA's largest donor is the Wasserman family. Casey Wasserman is the head of the LA 28 bid. So there is a degree to which these inherent conflicts of interest are baked really deep into Los Angeles's institutions and local government structures. Casey Wasserman is also was on the board of directors of the LA Police Protective League. So when we talk about these issues in Los Angeles, it's almost as if sometimes they're quarantined in academia. And it's not until they emerge from academia into popular movements that members of our organizations get targeted. And we saw that recently at a protest outside the mayor's office where someone who we organized alongside was picked up by the LAPD in a scrum just for protesting. Which again, these are maybe a little less acute in terms of being silenced as in other countries, but it is a more slow grind of these sort of neoliberal institutions that intersect along academic, governmental, and corporate lines to sort of build a power structure within the city that is very difficult to pierce. And we're just beginning to pierce in a lot of ways through this sort of popular movement and some recent electoral results.
And I'll just quickly weigh in and say that I moved to Victoria just 2 years before the Vancouver game. So I became involved in going to Vancouver and going to events. And when the torch came through Victoria, doing talks, and I felt very supported by my institution. I think being an indigenized institution, it's expected that I advocate for Indigenous rights. So I was very much, I think, supported in a junior role institutionally, where I feel a lot of pressure in terms of being critical and being active is in Indigenous contexts. And so I'm very careful in my work not to lay blame on, say, the four host First Nations who have decided to partner with the Olympic Games, because there has already been so much division within our communities from these colonial structures. And so the decision in these communities to partner with the Games, people don't understand the complexity that these votes were 51%. Half these communities weren't in support of partnering with these with the Olympics. And so there's very complex dynamics within the Indigenous communities, within the government frameworks. And it's not just that these four host nations decided to partner with the Games and they're bad and they're against Indigenous rights, they're co-opted. It's a very complex aspect of colonialism that I feel I really try to tread lightly in my research and work, not to call out Indigenous people and communities who choose to partner, because we're in a situation where Indigenous communities have been reduced to poverty. And when you say, here's some money to lift your community members out of poverty, you're in a pretty difficult situation. And so for me, I feel like I have institutional support to do my work in this area. Where I feel sort of institutionally vulnerable, or where I have to tread lightly, is how I critique Indigenous people and communities from partnering in these frameworks.
Thank you so much, everyone. I will reshare the link to your articles, because I would really encourage anyone who's watching now or who will watch in the future. This webinar will be recorded and posted on the City Institute YouTube channel, so you will be able to access it moving forward. And I'll make sure that the document is linked underneath that video as well. So here it is again to everybody. Thank you to all the panelists. Your presentations were phenomenal. Taught me so much. I feel, although it is getting late here, I feel totally energized from your work. So I appreciate it, and thank you. Thank you for taking the time. And thank you everyone for tuning in. I know there's probably no shortage of webinars online, or no shortage of time spent on a screen. So the fact that you are here with us and participating in this, and seeing you in the participant list really is energizing as well. So thank you everyone. Have a great night and stay safe.